Today we are going to talk about the remarkable life and work of Michio Ito. Michio Ito is considered one of the forgotten pioneers of modern dance, and this choreographer came to the West to become an artist. He studied eurythmics in Germany under Delcros, and at the outbreak of World War I, he moved to London, where he connected with the literary and artistic elites. He eventually moved on to the United States seeking more opportunity there, and he landed a job in New York City and began performing and teaching his unique style of dance as early as 1919. And he spent a decade in New York, eventually touring with his dance company nationwide until, starting in 1929, he was on the road touring. And he ended up in Los Angeles, dissolved the company, and and started another one, and started teaching in LA, and spent over a decade there, embracing the audiences who filled stadiums to watch his performance. His performances of his choreography filled huge stadiums like the Hollywood Bowl and the Rose Bowl. And in 1941, however, when World War II broke out and the bombing of Pearl Harbor, he was arrested, interned, and sent back to Japan, never to return again. Much of his legacy is lost because of his internment, and essentially he was erased from the history books. Like when I went through dance history, when I took my undergraduate dance history class, they didn't mention him. And he's not mentioned in many of the dance history books if you pick one up. But I want to share with you today some of his accomplishments and a window into his life. I think it's important to know that he is here, that he contributed a great deal to the development of modern dance. And he was someone who really made an impact on a lot of people. If you've ever taken a Luigi jazz class, Luigi studied from Michio Ito. And if you ever took a Horton technique class, you have a lineage of Michio Ito there as well, because Lester Horton studied under Michio Ito. So it's an important thing. He's an important figure to get to know, and he's not someone we should be overlooking at all. So we're going to look here at Michio Ito today. This quote, I think, is a really interesting one. It symbolizes Ito's mission and his technique in life. He always attempted to build this bridge of connection between the East and the West. The quote says that, "I'm an artist. My hope was to build a bridge between Japan and America." That really was his quote. That really was his mission. As an artist, my hope was to build a bridge between Japan and America so that a new, higher civilization could be developed. That such a destiny could be fulfilled. That was my fondest dream. So, as you'll see, that really was something that was important to him, and it became important to him for his life and everything he did. He continued on that ideal until he passed away. So it was something he was always working on. Let's get into a little bit about his life and how did he end up in America to begin with. Well, Michio Ito, he was born in 1893 to a very wealthy family that had an interest in modern ideas and in the West. He was born the son of an architect who had traveled and studied in the United States. His family had an interest in Christianity. He was there were things from the West that really fascinated him, and that he was open to. And really, there was some pressure on him from his parents to move into his father's line of work, to become an architect himself. But he showed an aptitude for musicality, and his parents enrolled him at the Tokyo Academy of Music, where he trained as an opera singer. So he loved music, and he went, and he had, and he was looking to become an to become an opera singer. And his mother and his uncle had an interest in theater. His uncle owned a theater company, and so from a young age he had some of that. He had some exposure to theater, and from a young age he had also had some training in Nihon Boyo, which Nihon Boyo means Japanese dance. It's a traditional classical Japanese dance form that's often mixed with pantomime, and it's a form that incorporates elements of older no and kabuki style dances, and it's a form that's refined and intended as entertainment for the public stage. It's um, a dance form, and Ito had some training in that. Ito's father had traveled, like I mentioned, to the United States and had worked with the famous architect Frank Lloyd Wright, both in the United States, and then when Frank Lloyd Wright traveled to Japan, um, he also worked with Ito's father there. Um, it may have been him who encouraged his son to branch out a bit to the West and seek additional musical training as well. His mother, his father both encouraged him and said, go, fly, go to the West. So in 1912, Michio Ito was 18 years old. Many of you might be um, remember, or you may be 18 or have been 18 recently, and around that age. But he left his house. Could you imagine leaving home, not speaking the languages at all? So he didn't speak German, he didn't speak French, he didn't speak English. He got on a boat and headed out for his future, really. And I think this took guts to do. I don't know. Can you imagine what that would have been like? Well, his ship landed in Marseilles, and he traveled to Paris, and you know he traveled, um, and it was a fortunate time for him to arrive in Paris and to witness Isadora Duncan perform. Anna Pavlova, he watched, and also Václav Nijinsky, both Pavlova and Nijinsky from the Ballet Russe. And he watched Isadora perform, and he was just forever changed. He was like, whoa, I'm not so interested in. He was like, I think I'm more interested in dance and movement than I am interested in opera. Just like the way people are in their bodies, it makes more sense to me to be a mover. So he had traveled across with his friend Kosak Yamada, who was a fellow musician and traveled on the boat with him. And he confided his ideas in Yamada. This is an image of Yamada. And he said, and Yamada encouraged him to go. He said, yeah. And Yamada would eventually would remain friends with him for the rest of his life and would compose music for his choreography, and they would stay close. But Yamada said, yeah, you should go. This is an image of Anna Pavlova, and this is an image of Isadora Duncan. And so people that changed his life forever. So he went to Germany to get further training, schooling, and dance. He enrolled in what was sort of the third year, really, of the Dalkoro School in Hallerau, Germany, which is a little suburb near Dresden. He was actively trying to learn English and German, and he was trying to speak other languages at the same time he was trying to study. And Michio Ito was the only Asian dancer and over 300 students at this school. And the vision of the school was really to point the way towards modernism, um, with its clear lines and its functional structure. That's really the focus of this school. It meant to bring to life the visions of the stage designer Adolphe Appa and also the music educator Emile Jacques Delcroze. And that's an image of him there. The theater building didn't have a stage curtain. It was a really interesting place. It had a rectangular sort of and retractable orchestra pit. It had this interesting diffused lighting along the perimeter and the walls. There was like all these lights that were behind this opaque glass, so that it just sent this ethereal light into the cathedral space. And the area for performing and watching the performances was sort of combined. So there was no real stage, and the audience and the performers merged into this sort of what they called the cathedral of the future. And it was like really a spiritual and sensational or sensorial unity. It was this place where the composition and structure and the dances and the music that were done there blended with the audience that was watching them. So the school, it was a very fascinating school, founded in 1810 by the second year there was this mixture of learners from all over the world, including the young Mary Wigman, who we're going to learn about later. And by the third year, by 1912, when Michio Ito was coming across on the boat, this school was performing to audiences of 5,000 people or more. So by the time Ito joined in 1913, this school had hit the height of its popularity. Hellerau, the suburb of Dresden, had really become the center of European modernism. And at Hellerau, he studied eurythmics, and which we've talked about before is this study where you gain this physical awareness of rhythm and structure and expression, and you learn how to focus and interpret musical rhythm and melodic structure with the physicality of your body. Well, unfortunately, that was the height of the school, but also a year later, Wolf Doran, who had founded the school and was like part of the money behind the school, well, he died rather suddenly in 1914. And by the summer of 1914, Emile Jacques Delcroze and Adolphe Epa, they took a trip to Switzerland. Things were heating up actually around 1914. Things were heating up in Germany, and they saw the writing on the wall. And so Delcroze and Apipa, they took a vacation to Switzerland, and they never returned. July 28th, 1914 saw the outbreak of World War I, and the international students at the school, they left. Michio Ito, one of them, he fled north to avoid the war, to avoid fighting. And he left and moved north to cross the North Sea into London. Yeah. But at that school, many European dancers, such as Mary Wigman, Kurt Jooss, who did the Green Table, he's the choreographer of the Green Table, and Rudolf von Laban came to the school. They came and they studied and they saw, or they saw. I mean, they would be many of the elites of Europe would come and watch the performances at Hellerau. It was a really important place. But like I mentioned, the school closed because World War I, and Michio Ito moved to London. He stayed in London for a few years, just a few years here. just from 1914 to 1916. He was really the years that he was in London, and by this point, he had really run out of money. He unfortunately he managed to get a small apartment, like one room studio apartment, and there are letters that postcards that he has sent back to his parents. So we have evidence of this, that um, he pleaded with them for money, and said basically, I've spent all of my earnings, can you send help? And his father did send some money, but it really didn't last that long. Michio Ito at this point was starving, really, a true starving artist, and he had to sell his belongings to eat. He socialized with wealthy individuals, though, and was invited to perform at some garden parties, and this is the way he paid his rent. He hustled, you know, he made a name for himself in London society. Of course, he had to pawn most of his belongings to eat, but he was finding he could sustain himself, and he learned how to, like, he was still generous and with his time, and didn't let his circumstances overwhelm him. And at this time, um, so he was these wealthy patrons were attending these garden parties, and he was there, and they really helped get him through. And like I said, he made a name for himself. And like at this time, William Butler Yeats, who was an Irish poet, pull it up here. Yeah. So Yeats, there on the left, he was an Irish poet and one of the foremost figures of the 20th century literature. He'd go on to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. Well, in 1909, Yeats met. So before all of this, a little bit about Yeats. In 1909, he met with this American poet Ezra Pound, and Pound had traveled to London in part to meet with Yeats and to study under him. Pound worked. He was someone who worked as a publisher and published the books of many, many artists. And Pound worked as Yeats' secretary for a while, and just to study under him and to work with him. Pardon me. Most notably, Pound had obtained a series of Japanese no plays that had been translated into English by Ernest Fenollosa. Here's Ernest Fenollosa. And he had translated a number of these things, these no plays, and in Ernest Fenollosa's wife, after Ernest passed away, she passed them on to Ezra Pound, and Yeats picked up on them and just used them as a model for his aristocratic drama that he wanted to produce, and he and the things that he wanted to write. And Pound had been interested in something called Imagism, which was a movement derived from classical Chinese and Japanese poetry that stressed clarity, precision, economy of language. Imagism is considered to be really the first organized modernist literary movement in the English language. It's a really and influenced a lot of artists and the modernist art and modernist way of thinking. And Pound and Yeats sought the help of Michio Ito in order to bring to life the dramas that he was putting together. And in April 1916, this was the first play. Was called At the Hawk's Well. It was a no-style play that Ito played the title role in. And it's interesting because Ito really didn't have any formal training in English. I mean, pardon me, in no theater. Remember, he had studied Nihon Boyo, and Nihon Boyo drew on some of no characteristics, but Michio Ito thought no theater was rather dull. It wasn't something he was really particularly interested in. But he got the part. He got into this part. He performed it many times in England and the United States, at the Hawk's Well. Um, I'll tell you just a little bit more about that. Here's an image of Michio Ito, because Michio Ito actually made the costumes as well. One of his brothers was a costume designer, and Michio created these costumes for the play and for the role. Um, the the play really has only three performers. There's a young man, an old man, and a hawk. And the hawk guards this well. It also has three musicians that play a traditional Japanese style music. The bamboo flute, the zither, the drum and gong, and the musicians play on the stage, and they're in full view of the audience, very similar to a no play. Here's sort of the gist of the story at the Hawk's Well. So there's this old man, and he's camped out near the well of immortality. It's said that if anybody drinks of this well, if you drink of the waters, you will live forever. And he's been there for 50 years, seeking after this well. Pardon me. Every time he tries to drink it, the waters disappear. Or the hawk comes by and just distracts him and guards the well and distracts him and like flutters in his face and gets him his way, and like attracts his attention elsewhere, and then the waters bubble up and he misses it. So time after time, this man has been trying to get there, and he misses it. So the young man, all of a sudden, a young man who's new to the well and is desperate to drink the waters. The old man tells him, "No, don't be like me. Don't waste your life this way, longing after the unattainable." The hawk dances around him and leads the young man off. And while he's gone, the waters of the well bubble up, and he returns and realizes he's missed the waters too. And so that's the way life is becoming. And so that it's kind of the lesson of like, just don't, the lesson, I guess, is to don't waste your life after something that's unattainable completely, but focus on the practical and live your life in the here and now. I guess that's kind of the moral of this story. This again is Michio. He's kind of goofing around here with the costumes. But Michio Ito left London because it was getting dangerous there as well. So in 1916, World War I was raging, and the war was coming to London. London was the first target of a sustained strategic bombing, like the first target of a sustained strategic bombing campaign in history. Bombs were falling, and they fell in London. Zeppelins would fly. Germans were flying Zeppelins over and bombing aircraft, and seaplanes were regularly killing and injuring people and causing millions of damage to property. So Ito found an opportunity in the United States, because 1916, the United States wasn't at war yet. They wouldn't enter World War I until 1917. But so in 1916, so that was on the horizon. But in 1916, Michio Ito moved to London, and he lands in New York City. He took another boat across the ocean and landed in New York City, and he wanted desperately to find peace. He wanted to bring together the sensibilities of the East and the West and to blend them in an artistic way, in his artistic way. He didn't want to represent all of Japan in his work. He just wanted to do his thing, and to be recognized as a creative individual with his own unique voice. So mid-1916, he moves to New York City. He starts having solo concerts, performing some of the work that he learned and that he choreographed. So when he was at Hellerau, he created a repertory of work, and he started performing it in the Greenwich Village, and Washington Square Players, Hanabok Players. He begins presenting work that looks like No and Kyojin plays that have been translated to English. So he's having these performances, and they're instantly successful, but he's more interested in his own voice. But there was an interest in some Japanese work, and so he played into that. But eventually he started to move away from the Japanese themed performances, and he's starting to find his own voice, something that is unique to him. He didn't, like I said, he didn't want his style to be limited by his cultural heritage. I mean, he was facing stereotypes and labels that were being placed on him by the audiences and the critics, and many of his employment came from opportunities, and he played into that. But he was really interested in blending the ideas of the East and the West, the Oriental and the Occidental. But he was a hustler, and he worked. This is an image from a piece of his. I've had the pleasure of dancing this piece called Pizzicati. It was choreographed in 1917, and this was one of Michio Ito's sketches of the work. In this piece, he stays in place, and there's a huge shadow that appears behind him. His feet are firmly planted in place, and he dances. This is another image. It's similar to that of that piece, and so he's choreographing this work, and this was sort of dedicated to Anna Pavlova. It was a work that he created. This is and in an interview around this time, he's quoted as saying, "In my dancing, it's my desire to bring together the East and the West. My dancing is not Japanese. It's not anything. It's only myself." And I think that's an important quote of his, because here's Michio Ito. This is a self-portrait of his that he drew. Michio Ito didn't want to represent all of Japan. People saw him that way. They saw him as, oh, here's the Japanese dancer, Michio Ito, and they would talk about him that way in articles and in when he was or in previews of his performances. But it would be like saying, oh, it would be like you going to a foreign country and saying, and then they would say, oh, here's the American dancer. Show me American dancing. What is American dancing? And that's just too much of a burden to place on one person's shoulders. It's too much. So he wasn't interested in representing all, like, my work is all of Japanese, or it speaks to all of what Japanese is. He just happens to be Japanese and is doing modern dance, right? He's just doing the work. Because at this time there was no modern dance movement in the country. In New York City, there was no modern dance in 1916, like we know it today. He made but Michio Ito in 1916 was making his living as a choreographer and a performer. And in 1917, he found some work with Adolf Bloom's ballet In Time. As an In Time company member, he performed on and off with this company. It was a relatively small group of international performers that toured, and they featured non-Western dances. So, there was this interest in Japanism and interest in the East. And, Bloom was this ballet russe dancer who had gotten injured and stayed in the United States and decided to form this company. And Michio Ito became part of that company for a little while. And he was also interested in really doing his own thing, and he was growing. And, the more that you teach something, the more you know it. And by 1919, he had formulated a methodology. Oh yeah, and he's also still performing his own work. So in 1918, he remounted a performance of At the Hawk's Well in New York City, and he started teaching in 1919 um, at Carnegie Hall. There was a place called Studio 61 in Carnegie Hall, and he really found a home there. And he developed his own style of dance there that was based a lot on the 10 principles or on a lot of what he had learned in Hellerau as a movement practitioner. Um, his teaching, um, he was this primary figure in the development of modern dance because he developed this codified technique that trained dancers how to perform his choreography, which is what generations and generations of choreographers would do after him. They would teach their own choreography so that people could learn their dances and their style of movement, and then they would go on and do the same. Um, so he gave concerts of his own choreography, and in the late 20s, as modern dancers, um, like Martha Graham, Doris Humphrey, Charles Weidman, they had been studying in a place called Dinishon. They were coming out of that school. Michio Ito was already a seasoned instructor, and he is already had a performer in that country. And so modern dance, as it was growing in the United States, in New York City, as it was starting to grow and develop, um, Michio Ito was seen as one of these pioneers. His performances were well received, and this was before, like I said, before Graham and Weidman. While they were still dancing with Denishon, he was doing work, and um, his work had been well received. And his sense was that Western music was abstract and open to interpretations, whereas traditional Japanese music was more narrative based. And so he was interested in dancing somewhat his style of music and movement to, and his tradition, the traditional dance that he's done in the past, and then what he's coming up with in the present, and blending all of that with this Western music that has this abstract form. And he thought that this would be a nice blending of the East and West, and that's what he was doing. He was creating this great work. He was also interested, he became a family man. He married a white woman named Hazel, someone who had been a dancer of his, one of his students, and one of his dancers, and one of these dancers in his company. And they got married, and they had children together. He had two children, Donald Ito, and Donald eventually went on and was contracted with polio, unfortunately, and he died. But Gerald Ito went on to have a long career in film and the movies. Um, and Gerald went on to have a daughter named, just after Michio passed away, um, Gerald's daughter, Michelle Ito, was born. And I've met Michelle and talked with her and consider her a friend. And she really now holds the legacy of the Ito work. So if anybody wants to perform Michio Ito's work now, they kind of have to go through Michelle Ito to do it, to have her permission and her grace to do it. So moving on here. Here's a picture of Michio Ito and his two boys. The older one, Donald, and the younger one is Gerald. And they are. He loved his kids. He loved his boys, and yeah. So it was a family life that he appreciated, and he loved being a dad. His company in the 1920s was growing alongside of Graham's and Humphrey's and Weidman's, and they all were creating work. And Michio Ito is recognized, by the critics as being one who was one of these performers, and he was singled out as an extraordinary performer and was growing his company. Here's another image of Michio Ito dancing, and early 1929, he had built his company up so that they were ready to tour across the country. A cross-country tour performing in many different cities. And they eventually ended up in Los Angeles, where he ran out of money. Um, Hazel Ito was with them. Pauline Kohner, who's also was a young dancer in her own right, was touring and traveling with them at this time as well. And he didn't have the money to get back to New York. And he was embraced by the audiences there in Los Angeles. And he decided, I'll just stay here. So his company essentially dissolved. And he decided to work and to stay right where he was. And then he started teaching at a local dance studio. This was the studio that he began, one of the studios that he started teaching at and performing at. And he had like two sets of, he would teach classes to the general public. He also would teach classes, he had like these master classes to those who had dance experience. And these higher level students of his, he started having performances with them and concerts with them, and that grew and grew in popularity. And he started filling stadiums like with the Rose Bowl and the Argus Bowl, which was on a private estate, and the Pasadena Bowl, and the Rose Bowl, and the Hollywood Bowl. He was performing and filling the stadiums, and they were accompanied by, huge orchestras, and thousands of people were coming out to see these performances. It was enormous. This is an image of his dancers, some of the dancers from his company. This is, wait, let me show you here, Barbara. This dancer, I met and interviewed her, and I got to meet her and go to her home and talk to her about the work that she was doing. Her name is Barbara Perry, and she was a sweet little old lady that when I met her and talked with her and had a full amazing life. But so this is one of the performances that they did, and and she's the one that all these pictures that you've given that I'm showing you here, they were given to me by her. So Michio Ito had a strong performing career and was making a name for himself. The performances were filling these, like I said, like the Hollywood Bowl, accompanied by the Philharmonic Orchestra. And in addition to staging these live performance events, he also performed in at least 6 feature films. So he was doing work. He was doing a lot of work in Los Angeles. He was also a part of the community that built Little Tokyo there. So he helped to lay and design Little Tokyo. So if you've ever been to Los Angeles, he had a major impact there. And in 1931, at the age of 38, he returned briefly to Japan with his wife and his 2 children, and he received recognition there as someone who had received international success. He was welcomed back into his elite circles there. He came from a wealthy family. He was well connected in Japan, and he traveled back and forth. When he did come back to California, however, Hazel and he divorced. I think because of Michio Ito's infidelity, I believe is why they got divorced. And he eventually remarried a Japanese woman there who he met in Little Tokyo there in Los Angeles. But the tide was turning in Los Angeles at the time. In California, there was this growing racism and beginning movements of an anti-Japanese sentiment. And Ito made several trips back and forth from Japan during this time. And that traveling back and forth led to some suspicion of him by the FBI. And they started taking notice of him and who he was and what he was doing. And so there was this growing anti-Japanese sentiment, and the FBI had really been watching Ito with interest. This is a man who had high-placed friends and relatives back in Japan, and Japan was sort of growing in its militaristic strength. And because of his trips, he fostered some suspicion and they were wondering what he was doing. And what happened was, when World War II struck, when it came to America, when Pearl Harbor happened, within 24 hours, he had been, he was being watched. They knew where he was, and they arrested him within 24 hours of the bombs dropping in Pearl Harbor. They were after Michio Ito. They accused him of espionage, and he spent 2 years traveling from one internment camp to another. And these were not just your regular internment camp. These internment camps were horrible. And hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans were pulled from their homes. Their property was taken away from them, and they were put into these internment camps. These camps, which were basically sheltering this group living, and everything was stripped of the Japanese Americans. Michio Ito wasn't just in a general internment camp. He was sent to more of a prison, because an internment camp for political prisoners. And in 1943, he and his wife were sent back to Japan on a prisoner exchange. I found this interesting, this work. This is evidence of his trial and what I came across this. These are the work that talks about when he was interned, and what some of the bits from that, the official papers of the orders of him being interned. One of the things, he was interned in Fort Missoula, Montana, February 13th, 1942 is where they took him initially. Subject is an alien enemy. Subject is an artist of artistic temperament, striking appearance, fine manners, cultured, educated, and capable of any and all sorts of propaganda, espionage, and sabotage. It goes on to say that this board feels that this particular alien is extremely dangerous to the security of the United States. He was an artist. He just wanted to bring the arts, he wanted to bring the East and the West together. All of this was, fabrication. He was not an enemy alien, but he was sent back to Japan, never to return again. So, the accusations were false. And shortly after the war, Ito was hired by the American Occupation Administration as a director of the Ernie Pyle Theater in Tokyo. It was a theater that organized performances for the GIs. So basically, the U.S. government that just had interned him as an enemy alien for 2 years and sent him to prison camps, they dropped all charges and said, "Can we hire you? Can we hire you to put on performances and for our boys in Japan? We're occupying your country, and we are, we'd love, and we've burned down almost all of Tokyo, but this theater happens to be still be standing. We want you to be the director there, the artistic director." And he was. He remained the artistic director of the Ernie Pyle Theater until his death. So he found work for many of the Japanese that were suffering and lost their homes due to the fire bombings in Tokyo. He stayed in Japan, and he got busy presenting other concerts, and he was really never an enemy agent. So, but he spent the rest of his life in Japan. He presented concerts. He was teaching his technique to the dancers. He formed another company there in Japan. Um, his students had performances. He worked as a theater director. He even established this modeling school because he had an understanding of a Western aesthetic and what they wanted. And there was, in the occupied Japan of the time, there was an interest in things that were from the West. And so he helped to establish this training program so that Japanese women could learn about Western fashions, Western traditions, and how to become fashion models. And so he did that. One of the big things about that he was also, in 1960, he was commissioned to choreograph for the opening and closing ceremonies for the 1964 Olympics, which were going to be held in Japan. His plans were really to further development of this mission of his, this lifelong mission of bringing the East and the West together. And here he wanted to bring all, that's what the Olympics is about, is bringing people together in brotherly love and competition and working together. Unfortunately, his dreams were never to be realized because he died of a brain aneurysm in 1961 at his desk, working at his desk to bring his dreams to fruition. He died rather suddenly, and he was. But when he had been taken away, um, this was him. He was still in Hollywood at this time, but it's a good picture of him just before everything changed in his life. Michio Ito never returned again to Japan. From Japan back to the East. From Japan, from the East back to the West. He was a man of who pursued beautiful dreams all his life. That's what his obituary says. This is another one of his sketches. Um, yeah, Michio Ito. I like this picture of him, but he was someone who we've lost his legacy essentially because of the rise of Americanism in modern art and modern dance. Uh, there was just not an interest in keeping his legacy alive, I guess, in the United States, and which is a huge shame. I learned about him when I was a graduate student, and I was helping my professor study about Bella Lewitsky, someone we'll learn about a little while later, someone I ended up dancing with. Um, and Michio Ito had taught Bella Lewitsky's teacher, and so some of Michio Ito's legacy lives on through me and the work that I teach and the technique that I do. So I like to think that there's a strong lineage there. And you'll find that learning what your lineage is important in modern dance because you can understand. Part of learning dance history is you get to understand, you're standing on the shoulders of giants. You're standing on the people in the legacy of those people that came before you and the work that they did. And Michio Ito he's part of my legacy. He's part of, but he's also part of everyone's because he was really a pioneer of dance in this country, and really paved the way for dance to happen here. And so, in the next lecture, we're going to learn about the four pioneers and how they grew dance in this country. And I believe that, but I don't want to. While we learn about the four pioneers, we've got to also recognize Michio Ito. He came before them, so but he's recognized as a pioneer. But he's really like the forgotten pioneer. But now you know, now you know him, and he doesn't have to be the forgotten pioneer anymore.